looking at Exodus chapter 2. And we looked at chapter 1, and we saw some comparisons. We saw that Exodus 1 opened up by telling us that the whole nation was there and they were multiplying. And we saw that in chapter 1 that there arose a new Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. And so we tried to make sure that we understood that similarity to what we have even on today. And what we also saw, even one thing I don't think I mentioned, but I probably should have, is that's very similar to even how the book of Genesis opens up. You have this environment where things are going well, the Garden of Eden, and there's God there working and dealing with Adam and Eve, and then all of a sudden there arose something that was different. And so very similar here in Exodus, where you had a king that was there to help and to benefit the descendants of Joseph, and then yet after that there arose somebody that was different. And so we tried to point that out in chapter 1, and we saw that when that new king came, he decided that these folks are a problem, and for whatever reason they just looked at it as an enemy. Their problem was they were doing well, they were multiplying, they were growing, they were being strong as a people, and they looked at that as a problem.
Thank God.
You're doing well, and that's a problem to us. And so there's a lot of people that have that notion and that idea that if you're doing well, it's a problem to them. You always got to keep that in mind. That spirit is not new. It's been around for a while. And so, we tried to point that out. And I think it's important also that we keep in mind that Exodus brings out in our thinking that they are not where they ought to be. Now, if you remember in Genesis, I think it was Genesis chapter 15, I think around verse 13, God told Moses that your people will be a great people, but they will go down into a land and they will be held captive for 400 years. And so them being in Egypt is not a surprise to God, and the trouble that they're going through, because God told Abraham that I will bring them out, and he is going to do that. He's going to bring them out. And it's important for us to keep that in mind, that when difficulties happen, the Lord, number one, is not surprised, and number two, he always has a way of bringing you out. All right. So now we're going to go ahead and get into our second chapter. But before we go, are there any comments, any questions? All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to get right into the reading here. Exodus chapter 2.
Chapter 2. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. When she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself in the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. When she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said,
This is one of the Hebrews' children.
Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter,
Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?
And Pharaoh's daughter said to her,
Go.
And the maid went, and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her,
Take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages.
And the woman took the child, and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said,
Because I drew him out of the water.
And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian, and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong,
Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow?
and he said,
Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian?
And Moses feared and said,
Surely this thing is known.
Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them, and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, How is it that ye are come so soon today? And they said,
The Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flock.
And he said unto his daughters, And where is he? Why is it that ye have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. And she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom. For he said,
I have been a stranger in a strange land.
And it came to pass in process of time, that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them.
All right. So there we go with chapter 2. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of time that is passing through in this chapter. We saw in chapter 1, we covered several centuries, several 100 years. And so now we are going to look, and we're covering quite a few years. We're looking at the edict that was given out at the end of chapter 1, which was that the Pharaoh said, well, because the midwives weren't successful in killing the babies when they were born, the last edict that came out in the last verse in chapter 1 was, well, when these boys are born, throw them in the river. We're going to throw them in the Nile River and allow them to drown or be eaten up by crocodiles. Now, keeping in mind that, and we're going to try to point this out as we go, each one, that the Egyptians served multiple gods. We serve one God. We serve the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the Egyptians served all sorts of gods. One of their gods is the god of the river, the god of the Nile. And so they decided that one thing that they were going to do was that since we don't want these boys to grow and to be turned into grown, strong men, and we pointed out on last week how that seems to be an issue when the enemy wants to destroy. He always looks to destroy the male. He wants to get the man, the head of the household, out of the way. And if you notice, if you even go back to the Garden of Eden, it wasn't that the serpent went to Adam, but yet it went to Eve. So it's always looking to find a way to divide. All right, and so we see that this is what happens here. Now, that god of the Nile is going to be addressed later on. But you think they'll say, well, why are they serving the Nile? Well, the Nile River is one of those rivers that seemingly is never affected by it ever running dry. A lot of rivers on really bad drought situations can run dry. But the Nile doesn't seem to have that issue. It seems to always be a strong running river, which means you can plant, you can do certain things. And so what you end up having in your mindset is that Nile River helps to provide for me. I can get drinking water. I can get water for my crops and a variety of different things that I can do with the Nile. So you look at the Nile as something that does what? It provides. Well, we got to keep in mind, who is our real provider? It's Jesus. And so we got to make sure that we don't make that switch over and thinking that something that is very successful and accommodating to our needs today and maneuver that in the position of our God. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people and cultures and times have done that. All right, and we got to make sure that we don't make that same mistake. So the Nile was something that they looked at from the Egyptian standpoint as something that they worshiped, and it was part of their pantheon of gods that they worshiped. So when we look at this chapter, so we see after that edict that there is this couple that have a child. Now we talked about these tribes, and I said I'll point these out. When we look at this, first it says, and there was a man in the house of Levi. So all of a sudden, let's pause and look at this. Which tribe is this? This is the tribe of Levi. Well, remember, Levi and Simeon were kind of linked together as men that were what? Fierce. These were men that seemed to like to do battle and do war. Well, if you're going to pick a mindset and a personality type to go to war with Egypt, you probably want to find somebody in the tribe of Simeon or Levi. In this case, they picked who? They picked Levi. When I say they, I'm talking about God. God picked out of the tribe of Levi. And I just find that interesting when I look at the prophecies that were given by Joseph, by Jacob to each of the tribes. And then as you go through the Bible, you try to look to see if the personality types that he described kind of match up. And I'll be doing that as we go through. All right. And it says, and the woman conceived and bare a son, and she saw that he was a goodly child. So there was something about this child that was born that they recognized that for whatever reason, and I think they were kind of like how the midwives were in the last chapter, where they decided when the Pharaoh said, when these kids are born, when these children are born, don't let the son stay alive. They wanted them to smother him. And they wouldn't do it. Well, very similar here, where Moses' parents are like, well, you know what? This is a good child. This God has blessed us with this child. I'm not going to just throw him in the Nile. So they tried to do what? They tried to keep him. So it says, so they hid him for what? 3 months. And I think that's a really, probably a difficult thing, trying to keep the child from crying and do different things that you would draw attention to yourself, that you are breaking the rule that they were establishing in that nation. But in verse 3, that's when it comes to a head. It says, and when she could no longer hide him, she took him and hid him and put him in an ark. So now, wait a minute. She's actually now decided that she's going to do what the nation, what Egypt said. I'm going to put him in the Nile, but I'm going to put him in the Nile in a certain kind of way. So she says she built an ark. It says, and she pitched it, put slime on it. In other words, she's making it what? Waterproof. And she put the child in it, and she laid it amongst the flags, so amongst the high growing brush, and sometimes it's like little high grass that's growing around the edges of the Nile, around the bank. And so she put him in there so that he wouldn't go rushing down the river, but would get stuck in those little flag grass reeds and kind of move a little slow, and pointed them towards where he knows that the Egyptian women usually like to go and bathe. All right, so she had a plan. Now, where did she get the plan? I think God put that in her heart. A lot of times when God's working with us, and what's interesting here is you don't see directly God speaking to her. But I think it's important. You know what we probably should do? Because there is a point where it is mentioned. Hebrews chapter 11. Let's turn to that real quick. Hebrews chapter 11. That's the chapter of faith, remember? All right, and let's look at, let's see, it should be around 11. Okay, yeah, so let's look at verse verse 23. So Hebrews 11 verse 23, and it says by faith by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child. All right, so we talked about that. And it says, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. So once again, in a situation where that is designed by the enemy to produce fear. Okay, I see Gabe and Calvin are here now. All right. So in a situation that is designed to produce fear, and for those that just joined on, we are in Exodus chapter 2, but I'm just making a quick diversion over to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, just to kind of point out something here. So once again, it says, and by faith, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. And the point I was making was that it's interesting that when the society of Egypt, or even our society, or situations that we can be in, have things designed that normally should produce fear, can we lean on the Lord in a way where the fear just doesn't manifest itself? You know that you should be afraid. You know that this is not just an ordinary situation. It's a dangerous and complicated situation. And when you add it all together, it should equal fear. But once again, how many times have we talked about that where the Lord has told us, don't fear. Why do you fear? Why were you fearful? Where is your faith? Why did you have little faith? And you go, and when we went through the Emerged Gospel, I tried to point that out. That it's like Jesus is trying to just drill it in our head. I know you're going to have a reason to be afraid, because he wouldn't tell us about not fearing if he didn't know we would be in situations where we would have opportunity to fear.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
But he's trying to drill it in our head, verse after verse, statement after statement, don't fear.
That's right.
And we see it yet again here in this in this relationship. So if we go further, and we're just going to go ahead and through this, we'll see some more of this once we get back to Exodus. But let's look at verse 24 of Hebrews 11, and it says, by faith Moses, when he was come of years, and we're going to see that in just a bit, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. All right, so somehow or another, he began to recognize who he really is. So you can be in a society that will raise you and tell you you're something, you're this, you're the king's heir, you're the son of the king's daughter, so you have a right to the throne or whatever it is. But Moses knew that's not what God had designed him for. God designed him for another task, and somehow or another, and it doesn't say how, he knew it. He understood it, that it was something more than what I see. So he said in verse 25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Mm-hmm. So he was in a place where if he just went along with what the society was saying, he would just enjoy what they offered. But he said, I'm going to suffer and go different. But that means going different, I'm going not my own way, but I'm going by what God says. And by going what God says, that means you're going to add difficulty. You're going to add stress, and you're going to add pain, and you're going to add some. And so, but he said, I'd rather to choose that. And so we're going to see that when we get back into there. All right, and we'll stop there. We could go on and on, but let's get out of Hebrews. Let's go back to Exodus. But I just wanted to have that pointed out. And there's another portion of Scripture that points out some of what we see here, and that's Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is giving his discourse to the Pharisees, and he's talking about the life of Moses as well. And we may or may not get back into that, but we'll see. All right. So now back to where we were, and so we see that in verse 6 it says, and when she had let's go back to verse 5. We didn't finish 5, and so actually we didn't even finish verse 4. Let's back up. Matter of fact, let's go back to verse 3 and go on down. Let's connect all this. It says, and when she could no longer hide the child, she took him in an ark and brush and dubbed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid him in the flags of the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him. So now, the mom puts him in this little ark, this little boat, and his older sister is watching to see what would happen. And what we end up seeing is, how you doing, Wesley? Good to see you there. All right, and so what we end up seeing is that the child is going down the river, and the sister is there to watch and protect. All right, and so it's interesting once again that we keep this in mind. It's a sign of what we look at, a type of how when God puts you in a situation that's difficult, He has those that are watching over you to watch and protect you. So Moses is in a situation that he can't control. Why? Because he's a baby. He's going down something that's way more powerful than him, and that's the current of this river. But the mom brings the older daughter, and she's like 11, and she's walking with the ark as it's floating down to look and to see where it's going. So that whole concept where God says that I will never leave you nor forsake you is illustrated here. We see this. Though it looks like the mom let it go, but the mom also sent the daughter. Keep an eye on it. So the connection is still there. All right. So verse 5, it says, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walking along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maids to go fetch it. So now, all of a sudden, Pharaoh's daughter sees this. The timing. It just so happens she's down there washing. Well, no, it just so happened. That's how God worked it out. All right. And so, it says, and when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. Now, the minute that she looked and opened up the basket, all of a sudden, just so happened that the baby starts to cry.
Right.
So you look at that. I heard one commentator say that the baby was floating down. It didn't make any noise. But the minute that the Pharaoh's daughter opened up the ark, they said God kind of pinched the baby's leg a little bit just to make him cry a little bit. I thought that was kind of a very good illustration to kind of point out that it just so happened that the baby cried at the time she opened it up. Because one of the things about a true nurturer, and what you find is that Pharaoh's daughter had a nurturing spirit. The minute that baby cries, her nurturing spirit just kicked in. All right, and so it says, and she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." So she wasn't tricked. She didn't think this was a Egyptian baby. She wasn't like, "Oh, I wonder what's going on here." She put it all together. She knows what's happening. She knows the story, but she's still going to do what is in her to do. She's a nurturer. She's a person that I cannot let this child, even though it was her father or her relative that said, "Throw the babies in the Nile." She's saying, "I can't do this." And so that speaks to your ability to be in the plan of God, even when your heritage is one that is traditionally against God. So sometimes people say, "Well, you know what? I'm raised in an atheistic family." Well, that don't matter. If God has, if you have anything in your heart to want to know truth, God will find you. I'm raised in a family that don't believe in Christianity. Well, that's fine. Yes.
It also brings out that scripture that God will make that your enemies will be your footstool. So in order to to bring that scripture out, he can use your enemies to be your footstool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that's true because the enemies of the Hebrew people at this point are the Egyptians. But in this particular time, God's got a secret agent. God's got a little spy in there. This and Pharaoh's daughter that has compassion, that has a nurturing spirit, that has something in her that's like God. And God is using that. So if you got anything in you that connects to any of the attributes of God, God can use that. Sometimes you have compassion like she had, but other people have this a spirit of giving or communication or administration or whatever it is that you have. God can use that because he knows you have it. And he's just going to wait for that right particular time. And this is that right and particular time for Pharaoh's daughter to be used. All right. And at verse 7 it says, "Then said her sister to Pharaoh's daughter." Did I skip something? Yeah, let me go back up. Verse 6. Let's read 6 again. "And when she had opened and saw it was a child, and behold, the babe wept, and she had compassion on it, and said, This is one of the Hebrew children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. Now, you look at that right there. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? So you have this problem. I can't seem to keep the child because they have the edict where I have to throw the child in the river. I put the child in the river, in the ark. Pharaoh's daughter finds it. And then when Pharaoh's daughter finds it and then brings the child unto herself, wants to keep it, but now she needs to have the child what? Nursed. So then, because the child has to be amongst a woman, keeping in mind they don't have a Similac back there where you can just go to the store, Infamil, so you can't just go get that. You got to find a woman that can nurse the child. So you have to find a woman that can breastfeed and so forth and so on, and take care of it until the child is weaned. And so the sister Miriam, she says, "You want me to go get one of these Hebrew women to nurse it?" And she says, "Yeah, go get one." So now, when it's all said and done, she goes and gets the child's mother. Pharaoh says, "All right, I'll give you. I have this child. I want you to take care of this child, and I will use your services, and I will pay you what? Wages." So now Pharaoh's mom not only gets to keep, Moses' mom not only gets to keep the child, but now she's getting what? Paid to take care of the child. Yes.
I just wanted to bring out that that Pharaoh's daughter absolutely knew that the sister was going to get the mother, because not even any Hebrew mother can nurse the child. Any Hebrew woman can nurse the child. It's got to be one that had a child to have those scientifically have the glands open. So even at that point, when the sister said, "Let me go get somebody," it had to have been somebody that just had the baby.
Right.
So she must knew from that point that this was the mother to this child.
Yeah, and so you look at this and you see a difficult circumstance, a difficult situation, problems, and somehow, some way, the Lord works it out. Now, how often do we hear that? We say that phrase, right? We say, okay, somehow, some way. But when you look at this particular story, and it's such a familiar story that sometimes we just glance over it and forget the difficulties that were overcome here. And so when you have a situation where your land is telling you to do something and you're trying to do the things that God tells you to do, but your government or your nation or your state or your county is having you to do something, and somehow or another they just said, well, you know what, we're going to trust God on this and we're going to do what they say in a very unusual and unique way and believe that God's going to work it out. And God does. And my point in just making sure that I emphasize this is that when trouble and difficulty and unusual circumstances come, a lot of times we think, well, there it is. It's all messed up now. There's nothing we can do. I've had this child. The child's going to die. Well, no. The child, number one, the child didn't die. And number two, you got to raise the child. And number three, you got paid to do what you would normally had to do for nothing. So, and you add it all together, and you're like, wow, well, where did this come from? Well, it came from God. That's how God works things out. And so you take this story and you bring it into your own life. And you go, okay, well, so now when I am going through difficulties and circumstances and things that I can't understand and don't know why, and these, the Egyptians have made these new laws and all these laws are coming out and these laws are impacting me, how's all this going to turn out to be something wonderful? And you don't see the answer. But guess what? The answer's there. When it's all said and done, you'll be like, wow, you know what? It actually did work out. It turned out for my best. I wouldn't have never gotten paid. If there was no law to kill the child, throw him in the river, I wouldn't have got paid to raise my own child. So there's a lot of little things that we can pull from that to help encourage ourselves when difficult times come. All right? So
the bottom line.
Go ahead.
The bottom line is that we know that God is with us all the time, but we just don't see it. Mm-hmm. But He's always with us because He said He'd never leave us, and that's showing you right there that God was always with him and with her.
Yep. Exactly.
And the other thing is that we have to learn to always give honor to God. We see these little nuances happening and blessings coming and things working out in a good but particular way, or not, a way that we saw not, and we say, oh, look at this, it's a coincidence or whatever, but that's God working it out. God is blessing and maneuvering and giving us favor in different areas. And we sometimes think, oh, well, it's just happenstance. Nothing is happenstance. Mm-hmm. God is working it out.
Right. That's right. All right. Anybody else? See, somebody else is joining by phone.
Elijah joined us.
And Elijah's here. He's at the table with us. All right. Anybody else? All right. Let's look at verse 10. It says, and the child grew. All right. So Moses is growing. So we're moving through some more years. And she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So after the mother had nursed her. Now here's where the impact is happening again. All right. Because the bottom line was she was being paid to nurse the child for what? For Pharaoh's daughter. So, let's look at this. All right, so you look, wow, she's got to bring the child now back after the child was nursed and grew. And it says, and he became her son. So the mom brought Moses back to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, because I drew him out of the water. Now, look at verse 11. This is very important. And he grew, and it said, and it came to pass that in the days when Moses was grown. All right, now we're going to stop there before we get to the next portion. All right, because sometimes you can read right past that and you forget what it says when Moses was grown. That's an important piece too. Because what does that tell us? He grew up under what? Under Egyptian education.
Egyptians.
All right? He didn't grow up as a Hebrew, though he is a Hebrew. But when he was grown, he went through all the Egyptian schools. He went through all the Egyptian training, all the Egyptians' alchemy and chemistry and philosophy and mythological stuff. He understood the gods of Egypt. All of that he got. He received all of that, as now he's a grown man with the Egyptian training. So that's why I don't want to just pass right by that. All right. So it says, when Moses was grown, that he went unto his brethren and looked upon their burden, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So, okay, so let's pause there for a minute. So Moses grew up with the Egyptian training and with the Egyptian schooling, and then for whatever reason he decided that he want to go and find out what the Hebrew life is like. Why? Because that's what. Go ahead.
Because he's a Hebrew.
Because he's a Hebrew, right? Go ahead.
His mother was always there. Somebody prayed for him.
Mm-hmm. All right. The mom's there always praying for him. But and I think that's all part of the equation, because when God has his hand on you, he's going to maneuver you through whatever it is that you may be entangled with. All right. And so it says that he went to go look at the burdens. Let me see how these people who I was raised with are treating these people who I was born to.
I can't take that.
All right. And let me just mute this for a quick second here. And so it's important that we recognize that sometimes there can be a difference. How you're raised, and then what your calling is. So you can be raised an atheist and still be called to be a preacher of God. You can be raised somebody that's just mean and can be still called to be somebody that's compassionate. So there's a lot of things that we can put into that, and I could go on and on talking about the comparison and give you biblical examples of people that were raised one way and turned out to be another. Moses.
But aren't we born that way? Aren't we born, as basically as a child of God? So it's always in us. Someone just has to bring it out of us.
That's right. That's right. That's so true. It is. And we're all like that. We all are living in a world and raised in a world that's different from what we are. Because when we go back to Genesis, it says that God made us in what? His image.
Right.
We are made in the image of God. And I find it interesting, being that I make that one of the commandments were that we weren't supposed to make any images of God. And I heard one commentator, he was saying, well, one of the reasons why we shouldn't make any images of God is because all you got to do is turn around and look at somebody else, because every person is made in the what? Image of God. So we're all walking images of God. And so when we finally learn our true nature, and that's our nature is to be God-like. That's our nature, is to be God-like. And if we can follow that, then it's important for us to then push through the Egyptian training, the way that we were raised, and different things, and find the ways that God has for us. All right. All right. So let's move on. Verse 12. It says, "And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." Now, if we were to go back into looking, and you could jot this down, I won't take the time to do it now, but in Acts chapter 7, and if you continue to read in Hebrews chapter 11, starting at verse 23, you'll see where, you know what, maybe we better read it. Yeah, Penny's reminding me what time it is, I know. But you know what, we better read it. Let's go to Hebrews 11 again. And I just want to make sure that we get this. Let's see, Hebrews 11. Let's go. Let's go to, back to verse 24. Hebrews 11, verse 24. And let's just read this. This is where we have it. All right. And it says, "And by faith Moses, when he came to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter." All right. That's what we're looking at, right? "Choosing rather to suffer the afflictions with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season." Now, ain't that see? That's the point. He would have had a really good life, just be an Egyptian, man. Just go ahead. But yeah, but that's not how God made me. God called me to be what? Hebrew. All right. It says 26, "Esteeming the reproach of Christ rather than the riches and treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the compassion of the reward." All right. "And by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured to see him that is invisible." All right. So there's what we see here, what's going on with Moses, with him killing this Egyptian. And sometimes when we read this, we just look, okay, he just went down to go check out his brother, and then he saw an Egyptian and a Hebrew striving, and he went and killed the Egyptian. Well, why? Well, because he's made a decision in his mind, and that's why he's down there. And you can kind of get to the thinking that, well, he wants to see what is it about these Hebrews that allow them to endure such hardship and keep on multiplying and keep on thriving. And he feels that they deserve, and you also can keep in mind, like Penny pointed out, the mother during that time when she was raising that child, you can guarantee that mother was putting into that child's mind stuff about who he is. You are a Hebrew. You are God's chosen person. You are, you can almost imagine what it is that the mom was putting into her, into his thinking.
Right, absolutely, into her son.
Exactly, into her son. And so now this is coming to fruition in Moses' mind. He knows that I got to go beyond just being this Egyptian guy. And he's down there and he's looking at the burdens and he recognizing that they're being treated wrong. Yes.
Even though, it comes a time when you have to make a choice. You're living in this world and they're giving you their philosophy. You're giving the truth about who you are, but still the choice, you have to make a choice, whether to go with God and follow God, or to go with the world and be worldly.
Exactly.
Well, it's just like people always say, you never forget what you learned as a child. As a kid, you always remember what you learned.
That's right. That's right. You do. You do remember that. It sticks with you. Sometimes stuff you learn as a child stick with you longer than stuff you learn as an adult.
Absolutely.
All right. So Moses now, he sees this Hebrew and this Egyptian striving, and you can almost imagine, it doesn't tell us directly, but it's probably one of those taskmasters that were over them. Remember, they were treating them with what? Rigor. That's what the chapter 1 was saying. They were treating him bad. And Moses saw the mistreatment and went and killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand, because he recognizes, I'm going to come here, I'm going to make a difference. All right, I'm gonna have something that's gonna have I'm gonna have a plan to help free them. Now, let's keep reading. I want to get back to Moses burying this guy in the sand in just a bit here, but let me read further, and then we'll point it out. And when he went on the second day, behold, 2 men of Hebrews strove together, and he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a what? A prince and judge over us. Well, that person who's trying to ridicule Moses has no idea that he's actually telling Moses exactly who he is. He is going to be a prince and a ruler over them. But then look at what he does. But he's saying it as a what? As a means of being ridiculing him. And he says, intendest thou to kill me as thou killed the Egyptian? And look at and Moses what? Feared. All right, here we go with that word again, right? And said, surely this thing is known. All right. And so, and now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. All right. Now, Moses recognizing, as we saw in the reading in Hebrew, that there was something that he was there to do. And he's trying to do it, but he's doing it in his flesh. He's trying to do it in his own way. Moses, in his flesh, was able to kill and bury one person. That's not how you overthrow a nation. But God's going to do it, and when God does it, he's going to bury a whole Egyptian army. He's going to bury the whole army in the Red Sea. All right? But Moses is trying to do it in his own strength and in his own time and in his own way. Because, see, you may know, okay, this is what God wants me to do. And that's fine. And it's good to know that. But be patient. Allow God to work it out in you. Well, that means I got to continue to struggle with this and to deal with this and to be a part of this and to walk in the Egyptian streets and to be part of the Egyptian culture for a time. God will show you your exit strategy. He will give you your way out. But Moses jumps the gun, kills this man, buries him in the sand. Now, the exit strategy has to be what? Executed immediately. Because he's got to leave. Why? Because Pharaoh is going to kill him. Keeping all this in mind, Moses is doing what he's doing. Still, does that stop God's plan? Not at all. God's plan is going to continue because Moses is going to go back out. So now, at this particular time, we kind of, through other scripture, we can say that Moses is about 40 years old. And so now he goes out into the desert and he dwells in the land of Midian. And if you go back and you look at the names of some of the cultures, the tribes that was sold, that Joseph was sold to, Midian was part of that. So it's interesting now he's going back to Midian, and that's just threw that in there just if you want to make that connection. All right. So in verse 16 it says, and now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. All right, and they had come to draw water and filled up the trough to water their flocks. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flocks. And when they had came to Reuel their father, he said, how is it that ye have come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian, not a Hebrew, an Egyptian delivered us of the hands of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us and watered our flocks. Okay, so once again, what's happening here? So Moses went down to this land in Midian, and he's sitting there by a well. It's interesting when we see how many times that people meet at the well in Scripture. All right, so Isaac met Jacob. No, Isaac's wife was seen at the well by the servant. Jacob met his wife by the well. When we talk about Jesus, you have the woman at the well, and there's a few others that I just can't draw by memory, but I find it interesting that oftentimes the Lord, through the Scripture, shows us that by this well is where things happen. What's in a well? Water. And one of the things that we are usually associated with the baptism of water is what? The Spirit of God. And so,
and who is the living water?
Who is the living water?
The living water?
That's right. That Jesus is the living water. Exactly. So we see that the nature of God is associated oftentimes with water. So it's no odd coincidence that we see all of these transformations and these coming togethers happening at a well. All right, but then there's this guy here, and currently right now his name, and probably in the way you would say it in the Egyptian vernacular, would be Ruel. We'll find out later that he is also called in the Hebrew tongue Jethro. All right, but Ruel is the father of these 7 daughters, and they go out and they get water for the flock. And usually what happens, because they're girls, when they go out there, the other shepherds, the guy shepherds, come in and they just bum rush them. They let them pull the water out, and then once they get the water out, they go bring their flocks up and allow their flocks to water, and forcing them to go back and get water again. But this time when they did this and try to run the same scam, all of a sudden Moses pops up. Moses once again sees somebody being what? Treated wrong. Now the reason Moses is out there in the desert is because he stood up, because he saw somebody doing what? Being treated wrong. And he stood up. So somebody would say, well, Moses, didn't you learn your lesson? What benefit did you get by helping people that were being treated wrong? But Moses,
part of God's plan.
It's part of God's plan. That's right. And so Moses didn't stop doing what he knew was what was in him, because once again, more than likely, that was put into him when he was a child by his mom. We're being treated wrong here in in Egypt, but it's important to recognize that if you can help those that are being treated wrong, you should help them. And so he does it again, and he helps the women, helps them fight off the shepherds that are coming to try to overtake their work of already pulling out water for their flock. Continues to help them water in the flock, and then sends them on their way. And then when they get home, the father says, hey, you guys are back. Y'all didn't get the same abuse like you normally got? And they said, no, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. All right. And so in verse 20, it says, and he said unto his daughters, and where is he? Now here's a man with 7 daughters, and you said you saw a guy coming down there that helped y'all, and y'all left him out there all by yourself? Don't you think he's trying to find some husbands for his daughters? So he says, well, where is he? And says, and he said to his daughters, and where is he? And why is it that ye have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread. So bring him here. We're going to have dinner. Verse 21. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. And he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. And she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom. For he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. All right, so he's in a strange place. He's a stranger. This is something what? Very new. Things are different from Moses now. Moses is used to the eloquence of Egyptian life. Now he's living in what? The desert. Verse 23. And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. And the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage. And they cried, and their cry came unto God by the reason of the bondage. And God heard their groanings. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, and with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Now, that's where chapter 2 ends. And I think it's important that when we read that verse 23, 24, 25, that we don't get the wrong conclusion. Because it talks about the Pharaoh dying, the one that did not know of the goodness of the relationship they had previously with Joseph. And he treated the Hebrews bad. And so now after his death, that the Hebrews begin to cry. Don't get the misunderstanding that God didn't see them, because this verbiage may kind of lean that way. God always saw their problem. As a matter of fact, if we go back, I won't go back and read it, but if you go back in Genesis chapter 15, you'll see that God foretold this. God said, you're going to go into a land, you're going to be there for 400 years, but then I'm going to come and I'm going to deliver you. So the verbiage is here just to help us to kind of, from a human standpoint, connect that God is about ready to do what he had promised way back. And then it does give us that hint, because he said he remembered. And keeping in mind, when it uses the word God remembered, it wasn't like God said, oh yeah, I almost forgot about this. It's not that. It's allowing us from a human standpoint to understand an infinite being that has no ability to not know anything but to know everything. And so, well, how would you then say that God's about to act? Well, we can't find a word or a philosophy to explain it. So then what happens is that the conversation is dumbed down to our level and give us metaphors and different phraseologies that we can relate to explain what God is doing. But God is doing it at a way higher level. So it uses a word like God remembered. It ain't like God had to remember something. He always knew. All right, and so that's something that we should always keep in mind. And so what we see here as we're ending in chapter 2 is that God is now at the point where he's getting ready to intervene. And when he intervenes, the first thing he's going to have to do is make sure he's got your attention. And so when we look at next week, we're going to see how God is going to get the attention of Moses. And he's going to do it in a very miraculous way. And that's something that we can keep in mind as well. And we'll talk more about that on next week. But just as a precursor, if God wants you to do something, don't worry. He knows where you are. He'll get your attention. And he'll let you know it's time to do this or to do that. All right, so we're going to stop there. Any other comments or questions? All right. So we're going to just, once again, continue, the Lord say, with this on next week. We'll do this as well. Let me unmute Gabe. Gabe, how you doing? All right. I unmuted him, but I don't hear him. All right.
Excuse me, before we close, I want everybody to keep my older sister Audrey in their prayers. She had a heart attack.
Oh.
She had some blockage in her heart. They put 2 stents in her heart. She's doing a lot better, but I just want everybody to keep her in prayer. Her name is Audrey Jones. She's my older sister.
Oh, okay. All right. We're going to do that.
We'll do.